From the moment his name is mentioned, Malcolm X provokes strong reactions. To some, he is remembered as an uncompromising radical. To others, a fearless truth-teller who refused to soften his words for comfort or approval. But the full story of Malcolm X is far more complex, more human, and more instructive than the version most people encounter in school textbooks. His life was not a straight line of anger or ideology. It was a journey shaped by trauma, transformation, discipline, and ultimately reflection. To understand Malcolm X is to understand not just a man, but the historical forces that produced him and the lessons his life still offers today. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska. The United States he entered was rigidly segregated, and racial violence was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister and an outspoken supporter of Marcus Garvey, a black nationalist leader who promoted racial pride, economic independence, and self-determination for people of African descent. Because of Earl Little's activism, the family was repeatedly targeted by white supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion. Threats were constant. When Malcolm was still a child, his family was forced to flee Omaha after white supremacists warned them to leave town. They relocated to Lansing, Michigan, hoping for safety, but intimidation followed them there as well. Their home was eventually burned down under suspicious circumstances. Authorities ruled it an accident, but the family believed it was an act of racial terror. In 1931, when Malcolm was just 6 years old, his father was found dead on trolley tracks. The official ruling labeled the death an accident, suggesting Earl Little had been hit by a streetcar. But many in the community, including Malcolm's family, believed he had been murdered by members of the Black Legion, despite evidence suggesting foul play. Insurance companies refused to pay full benefits, plunging the family into financial hardship. The loss of his father marked a turning point. Malcolm's mother, Louise Little, struggled to support her children amid poverty and relentless pressure from social welfare agencies. Over time, the stress took a devastating toll on her mental health. When Malcolm was 13, Louise Little was committed to a state mental institution, where she would remain for decades. The children were separated and placed in foster homes. This early fragmentation left deep scars. Malcolm later described these years as the foundation of his distrust of institutions and authority. He experienced firsthand how social systems treated black families not with support but with control and punishment. These formative experiences planted the seeds of his later critiques of American society. Despite these hardships, Malcolm was an intelligent and capable student. In school, he excelled academically and was well liked by his teachers. At one point, he expressed a desire to become a lawyer. But when he shared this aspiration, a white teacher discouraged him, telling him that such a career was unrealistic for a black student and suggesting he aim for something more practical. Malcolm never forgot that moment. It was a clear message about the limits society placed on him, regardless of talent or ambition. Disillusioned and disconnected, Malcolm dropped out of school and moved to Boston to live with his half-sister. There, he was introduced to urban nightlife, hustling, and street culture. Later, he moved to Harlem, where he became involved in gambling, drug dealing, and petty crime. These years were marked by instability and survival rather than purpose. Malcolm later spoke candidly about this period, describing it as a time when he was lost, reacting to the world rather than shaping his place in it. In 1946, Malcolm was arrested and convicted of burglary. He was sentenced to 8 to 10 years in prison. It was during his incarceration that the most significant transformation of his life began. At first, he was angry and defiant, earning the nickname Satan from fellow inmates for his rejection of religion and authority. But prison also gave him something he had never truly had before: time to think. Through correspondence with his siblings, Malcolm was introduced to the teachings of the Nation of Islam, a religious movement led by Elijah Muhammad that combined elements of Islam with black nationalist ideology. The Nation of Islam taught that black people were the original people of the world and that white supremacy was a historical injustice that needed to be confronted, not accommodated. Malcolm began reading obsessively. He copied the dictionary by hand to improve his vocabulary and devoured books on history, philosophy, and religion. Education became a form of liberation. By the time he was released from prison in 1952, he was no longer Malcolm Little. He had rejected his surname, which he viewed as a legacy of slavery, and adopted the name Malcolm X, with the X symbolizing the unknown African name taken from his ancestors. Upon his release, Malcolm quickly rose within the Nation of Islam. He became one of its most effective ministers and public speakers, known for his discipline, clarity, and uncompromising rhetoric. He helped establish new temples across the country and dramatically increased the organization's membership. His speeches attracted national attention, particularly as the civil rights movement gained momentum in the 1950s and early 1960s. Unlike leaders who emphasized integration and nonviolence, Malcolm X argued that black Americans should focus on self-respect, economic independence, and self-defense. He criticized what he saw as the hypocrisy of American democracy, pointing out the contradiction between the nation's ideals and the lived reality of racial oppression. Importantly, he did not advocate unprovoked violence, but he insisted that black people had the right to defend themselves if attacked. This stance made him controversial. Media coverage often portrayed him as extreme or dangerous, while supporters saw him as honest and courageous. His sharp critiques of American racism resonated deeply with people who felt excluded from the promises of gradual reform. However, tensions were growing within the Nation of Islam. Malcolm's visibility began to eclipse that of Elijah Muhammad, and internal disagreements surfaced. In 1963, after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm made comments suggesting that the violence was a consequence of America's own actions. The Nation of Islam suspended him, officially citing the remarks, but the split ran deeper. In 1964, Malcolm X formally left the Nation of Islam. This decision marked another major turning point. Free from organizational constraints, he began to reassess many of his earlier beliefs. That same year, he undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey that would profoundly reshape his worldview. In Mecca, Malcolm encountered Muslims of all races praying together as equals. He later wrote that this experience challenged his previous views on race and demonstrated the possibility of genuine brotherhood across racial lines. While he did not abandon his critique of racism, his perspective became more global and nuanced. He began to see the struggle of black Americans as part of a broader human rights issue, not just a domestic civil rights problem. After returning to the United States, Malcolm founded new organizations focused on political education and international solidarity. He spoke increasingly about human rights, colonialism, and global inequality. His tone shifted from absolute separation to conditional cooperation, emphasizing justice over racial categorization. This evolution did not make him safer. In fact, it increased the threats against him. He was now isolated from the Nation of Islam and under surveillance by government agencies concerned about his growing international influence. His home was firebombed in February 1965, narrowly missing his family. Just days later, on February 21, 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated while preparing to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. He was 39 years old. His death shocked the nation and left many questions unanswered. Over time, historical research has revealed that surveillance failures and internal conflicts played significant roles, complicating the official narrative surrounding his murder. Malcolm X's life was short, but its impact has endured. He was not a static figure frozen in one ideology, but a man constantly learning, adapting, and refining his understanding of the world. That willingness to evolve is one of the most important aspects of his legacy, yet it is often overlooked. In the years following his death, Malcolm X's image was often simplified. He was frequently reduced to a single phase of his life, usually the most confrontational one, while his later evolution was minimized or ignored. This selective memory made it easier to place him in opposition to other civil rights leaders, framing history as a conflict between extremes rather than a spectrum of strategies shaped by circumstance. In reality, Malcolm X and other leaders were responding to the same oppressive system in different ways, speaking to different audiences, and addressing different needs within the black community. One of the most enduring contributions Malcolm X made was his insistence on psychological liberation. He argued that freedom was not only a matter of laws and policies, but also of mindset. Generations of oppression, he believed, had taught black Americans to see themselves through the lens of inferiority before true equality could exist. That internalized damage had to be confronted. This emphasis on self-respect, self-knowledge, and historical awareness became foundational to later movements centered on black pride and cultural affirmation. Malcolm was also among the first prominent American figures to frame racial oppression in the United States as a human rights issue rather than solely a civil rights matter. Civil rights, he pointed out, were dependent on the goodwill of the government that had long failed to protect black citizens. Human rights, by contrast, placed accountability on the international stage. By taking the struggle beyond national borders, Malcolm sought to expose American racism to global scrutiny, particularly during the Cold War when the United States claimed moral leadership in the world. His speeches after leaving the Nation of Islam reflected this broader vision. He spoke about African independence movements, Asian revolutions against colonial rule, and the shared experiences of oppressed people worldwide. He argued that racism, economic exploitation, and political domination were interconnected systems. This internationalist perspective influenced later activists and thinkers who saw domestic inequality as inseparable from global power structures. Malcolm X's intellectual growth was not without contradictions. He never claimed to have all the answers, and he openly acknowledged when his views had changed. This honesty set him apart. In a political culture that often rewards certainty and punishes revision, Malcolm treated learning as a strength rather than a weakness. He urged audiences to think critically, to question narratives, and to seek truth even when it was uncomfortable. The publication of his autobiography later in 1965 played a crucial role in shaping his legacy. Told through his own voice, the book traced his transformation from a troubled youth to a disciplined activist and, finally, to a reflective global thinker. It became one of the most influential nonfiction works of the 20th century, read not only by activists but by students, artists, and scholars around the world. For many, it served as a blueprint for self-education and personal reinvention. Over time, official recognition of Malcolm X slowly increased. Schools, streets, and cultural institutions were named in his honor. His speeches were studied alongside those of other civil rights leaders. Yet even today, his ideas are often quoted without context, stripped of nuance, or used to support positions he himself may have revised. This selective use of his words highlights the very issue Malcolm warned against, the danger of freezing history instead of engaging with it honestly. Understanding Malcolm X requires accepting complexity. He was shaped by violence but sought dignity. He spoke with anger but also with discipline. He challenged integrationist ideals while later acknowledging the possibility of unity rooted in justice. His life reminds us that political thought is not static and that growth often comes through struggle and reflection. The story they rarely teach in schools is not simply that Malcolm X was radical or controversial or militant. It is that he was dynamic. He was a man who refused to let trauma define him, who educated himself against overwhelming odds, and who continually reassessed his beliefs in light of new experiences. His journey shows that people are capable of change, even profound change, when they are willing to confront both the world around them and the assumptions within themselves. Today, Malcolm X's relevance remains unmistakable. Questions about racial inequality, state power, identity, and justice continue to shape public debate. His insistence on self-respect, historical truth, and global awareness speaks directly to these conversations. Studying his life does not require agreement with every position he held. It requires recognizing the value of critical thought, moral courage, and the willingness to evolve. Malcolm X once warned against accepting comfortable myths in place of difficult realities. Remembering him fully means resisting simplification and embracing the complexity of history itself. His life challenges us to ask not only how far society has come, but how honestly it confronts its past and how open it remains to transformation in the future.